All right, so today we're going deep on process theism.
Ooh, that's a fun one.
Yeah, it's a school of thought that really flips the script on how we usually think about God. Like, what if God isn't this static, unchanging being way out there somewhere?
Right, it really shakes things up.
We're going to be looking at some excerpts from the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy's entry on process theism for this one.
The Stanford Encyclopedia, always a solid choice.
Yeah, definitely a deep dive for sure.
Well, that's why we're here, right? To get into the nitty-gritty.
Absolutely.
Mm.
So to set the scene, process theism really pushes back against that classic image of God as this, like this totally fixed, unchanging being outside of time and space.
Yep. Yeah, it's kind of like instead of God creating the universe and then just, stepping back to watch it all play out, process theism is saying, no, God's right there in the mix.
Oh, so like less of a divine architect and more of a, I don't know, like a cosmic dancer.
I like that cosmic dancer. That's a good one. It really
Right.
captures that energy and connection that's at the core of process theism.
And this whole idea was really spearheaded by two big names in philosophy, Alfred North Whitehead and Charles Hartshorne.
Oh, yeah. The heavy hitters. They basically said, look, God isn't just watching from the sidelines. God's an active player in this whole grand unfolding of the universe.
And that leads to one of the most radical ideas in process theism, right? This idea that God isn't the only one with creative power.
Yeah, in this view, everything has at least a little spark of creativity in it. It's not just God making things out of nothing. It's more like this constant becoming.
So are we talking like we're all co-creators with God adding our own threads to this ever-changing tapestry of existence?
That's a bold statement, isn't it? It makes you think about free will and how God relates to everything we do. But hold on, let's not get ahead of ourselves. We've got to talk about another big idea, real relations in God.
Okay, real relations in God. So, I mean, isn't it already a given that God relates to us in some way?
Well, in traditional theism, God is often seen as being impassible, meaning like God isn't touched by all the stuff that goes on in the world, like joys and sorrows.
Oh, so process theism is saying that's not just wrong. It actually kind of undermines the whole idea of God's love and compassion.
Exactly. If God is completely detached from our experiences, can God really care about us? Can God really love us?
That's a good point. To truly love someone, you have to be open to being hurt by them, to be
That,
vulnerable, right?
right. And process theism is saying God is vulnerable, God is open, God is right there with us, feeling everything. We feel all the joy and all the pain, too.
Whoa, that's intense. And I imagine it raises some tough questions like, if God can be affected by suffering, does that mean God can feel negative emotions too? Does that take away from God's perfection?
Those are exactly the kinds of questions that process theism tackles. And to understand how it does that, we need to talk about one of its most mind-blowing concepts, dual transcendence.
Dual transcendence. So this sounds pretty heavy.
It is, but it's also super profound. It basically means that God embodies both sides of those classic philosophical opposites, like permanent and fluid one, and many absolute and relative.
Wait, so are we saying that God can be unchanging and changing at the same time? How does that even work?
It definitely makes you rethink how you see God. Whitehead, one of the guys we talked about earlier, he said God has these two natures. The primordial nature, which is like this huge reservoir of all possibilities, and then the consequent nature, which is constantly changing, shaped by all the experiences of the world.
So God is both dreaming up everything that could be and experiencing everything that is.
Just got it. And Hartshorne, the other big name in process theism, he focused on the difference between God's necessary existence, like the unchanging essence of God, and God's contingent actuality, which is always evolving, influenced by the world.
Okay, I think I'm starting to see how process theism can say that God is affected by suffering while still being perfect in some way. It's not that God can't change or can't feel pain. It's that God's fundamental nature stays the same, even as God is open to everything that happens in the world.
And that openness, that willingness to be affected, is key to how process theism sees love and compassion. Think about it. If God couldn't be truly touched by our experiences, how could we ever say God really cares?
It makes you wonder how much richer our understanding of God's love could be if we saw God as someone who's really in a relationship with us, feeling everything right alongside us, not just watching from a distance.
Right there with you. And that idea of God feeling with us, that really takes us into this other big area where process theism is different from traditional theology. The whole question of God's power, and especially when we think about the problem of evil.
You're talking about that classic dilemma. If God is all powerful and all good, then why is there so much suffering in the world? Does process theism actually think it can answer that?
Well, it definitely gives us a new way to think about it. Remember how we talked about dual transcendence? Well, process theism applies that same logic to omnipotence. It challenges the idea that God's power is like total control over everything.
So it's not like God can just snap their fingers and make all the bad stuff disappear.
Right. Exactly. Process theism says that way of thinking about omnipotence. It's like a false choice between God controlling everything or God being powerless to stop evil. It's saying there's another way to see it, a God who works persuasively, within the limits of a world where freedom and creativity are really important.
Okay, I'm listening. But how does that explain all the terrible things that happen if God could somehow influence things for the better? Wouldn't a God who truly loves us do that?
That's where the idea of persuasive power comes in. It's like imagine a really good chess player. They can't force their opponent to make certain moves, but they can set up the board in a way that makes certain outcomes more likely instead of nudge the game in a certain direction.
Oh, so God is like a cosmic chess player, subtly guiding the universe toward goodness and beauty, but still letting creation make its own moves.
I like that analogy. It means that God isn't micromanaging every little thing. There's room for real spontaneity, for things to happen that no one expected. And yeah, that means things can go wrong sometimes too.
But wouldn't a God who truly loves us want to prevent suffering, even if it meant limiting freedom? Isn't the price of freedom too high if it leads to so much pain?
That's a question that philosophers have been wrestling with forever, and process theism doesn't shy away from it. It says, yeah, suffering is part of a world where freedom and creativity exist, but it also asks us to think, what kind of world would we have without those things? Would a world where everything is predetermined, where there's only good but no choice, would that really be meaningful?
That's a good point. I guess a world without freedom couldn't have real love or real creativity or even real growth. It would be like a play where everything is perfectly reversed, but
Yeah.
there's no real feeling behind it.
Right. Process theism is saying that a world with the possibility of both good and evil is more valuable, more authentic than a world where everything is safe and planned out. It's like saying, yeah, the risk of heartbreak is worth it because it means you can experience real love.
I get what you mean, but that still leaves us with the problem of suffering.
Mhm.
It's still real. Does process theism give us any comfort or any way to make sense of it all?
It does, and this is where it gets really powerful. I think, remember, process theism insists that God isn't just watching from a distance. God is actually affected by suffering. God experiences it along with us.
So you're saying God suffers too. That's a very different picture than the traditional idea of God as distant and unaffected by human pain.
It is, and it's an idea that has given a lot of comfort to people who struggle with the problem of evil. If God really experiences the world with us, then God understands our pain. God is in it with us. It's a reminder that even when things are really bad, we're not alone.
That's a beautiful idea,
Yeah.
but it's a lot to take in. But if God feels our pain as it happens, doesn't that mean there's a limit to God's knowledge, a restriction on what God knows?
That's a sharp observation, and it takes us to another area where process theism shakes things up. It challenges that traditional idea of God knowing everything, including the future, with absolute certainty. Instead, it proposes that the future isn't totally fixed. It's being created in each moment through this interaction between God's influence and the free choices that people make.
Hold on, are we saying that God doesn't actually know what's going to happen? Isn't that kind of a big deal when we're talking about a divine plan?
It definitely moves away from that classical theism idea of God having a blueprint for everything. Process theism says the future isn't a script that we're all following blindly. It's more like a giant improv session,
Yeah.
a work in progress that unfolds through the choices we make, the actions we take, the relationships we build, all within the context of God's persuasive influence.
So God's less like a screenwriter and more like I don't know, like a jazz musician, maybe someone who sets the tempo, lays down the basic structure, but leaves a lot of room for freedom and improvisation within that.
You nailed it. That really captures that dynamic, ever-changing view of reality that process theism has. God isn't following a pre-written script. God is actually participating in the composition, responding to the notes that we play and weaving them into this grand, ever-unfolding symphony.
That's a beautiful image. But if God doesn't know the future for sure, then what about things like prophecy or divine providence? Do those ideas even make sense in process theism?
They do, but we have to understand them differently. Prophecy, for example. It's not so much about predicting specific events, it's more about seeing patterns, possibilities, potentials within the flow of time. It's about recognizing the currents of history and understanding how our actions might play out.
So it's less about fortune telling and more about wisdom insight, offering guidance based on a deep understanding of how everything is connected.
Exactly. And divine providence, it's not about God controlling every outcome or making things happen according to some predetermined plan. It's about God working within the limits of a free and creative universe to bring about the most good possible, responding to our choices with love and grace, even when we mess up.
That's a really subtle view of God's involvement in the world. It acknowledges that time is complex, that human freedom is unpredictable, and that there's a lot of mystery at the heart of existence.
And that brings us to an interesting question. How has process theism, with its radical reimagining of God, been received within established religious traditions? Has it gained any traction, or is it mainly an academic philosophy thing?
So we've been really getting into this process theism view of God, and it's super interesting, but there's this one question that keeps popping up for me.
Oh, yeah. What's that?
Well, with all this talk about co-creation and persuasive power and God experiencing the world with us, it all sounds really thought-provoking. But it seems like it kind of depends on God actually existing in the first place.
Ah, you're hitting on a big one. Can process theism, with all its challenges to traditional ideas about God, can it still give us good reasons to believe in God at all?
Exactly. And honestly, after everything we've talked about, I'm not even sure what those reasons would be. Does process theism even try to prove God's existence in the same way that classical theism does? What those cosmological arguments and ontological proofs?
That's a really good question, and it gets to how process theism approaches the whole idea of God existing. It doesn't try to come up with those like slam dunk arguments that will force everyone to believe it's more philosophical. It's saying the idea of God is necessary if you really want to understand reality in a complete and coherent way.
So it's less about proving God exists without a doubt and more about showing that the idea of God just makes sense if you look at the world in a certain way.
Think of it like putting together a puzzle. Process theism is saying the pieces don't all fit. The picture is incomplete unless you add in the piece that represents God.
Okay, I can see how that might appeal to philosophers who are already into those big metaphysical questions.
Yeah.
But can you give me some examples of how process theism actually makes that case? What are those missing pieces that point to the made for God?
Well, let's start with the idea of universal creativity. Like we talked about earlier, process theism says that everything in the universe has at least some ability to make choices, to bring new things into being, to be part of this constant process of becoming. But where does that creativity come from? What's the ultimate source?
That's a really interesting question. If everything is creative, there has to be some ultimate source of creativity, like a wellspring, that everything else flows from.
Exactly. And process theism says that ultimate source is God. God is like the most creative being, the ultimate artist who kicks off the whole creative process and inspires all other forms of creativity.
I like that it's like God is composing this huge cosmic symphony, and each of us, every little atom, every galaxy, we all play a part in bringing that music to life.
That's a great way to put it. And this idea of God as the source of creativity, it connects with another key argument in process theism. The argument from order, we see that the universe isn't just a random jumbled mess. There's this amazing order, this complex interconnectedness that's in everything from the laws of physics to the way ecosystems work.
Yeah, it's like there's a purpose, a design, some kind of intelligence built into reality itself.
Right, and process theism says this interconnectedness, it's not just an accident. It points to a divine ordering principle, a God who is always working to bring harmony and coherence to the universe, bringing everything toward greater beauty and complexity.
So instead of just accepting order as a basic fact of nature process, theism sees it as evidence of an underlying intelligence, a creative force that's shaping the universe from within.
Exactly. And this order, this design, it's not static or imposed from outside. It emerges naturally from within the creative process itself. God isn't a dictator giving orders. God's more like a persuasive influencer, guiding the universe toward its full potential, always working in partnership with creation.
That's a really cool picture. But I bet some people would say that order can be explained without bringing God into it, through things like evolution or the laws of physics.
Yeah.
How does process theism deal with that?
Process theism totally acknowledges the role of natural processes and how order emerges. In fact, it embraces those scientific discoveries. But it goes a step further, saying that these processes themselves point to a deeper reality, a ground of being that goes beyond just the material world.
So it's not about denying what science tells us. It's about interpreting those findings within a bigger metaphysical framework, one that includes the idea of God as the ultimate source of creativity and order.
You got to process theism wants to build a bridge between science and religion to show how these two ways of knowing can work together to help us understand the universe better. It's about recognizing that reality is more than just matter and energy. There's a deeper meaning, a purpose woven into the fabric of existence.
That makes a lot of sense. It's a way to find room for both those awesome discoveries of science and the really deep questions about meaning and purpose that have always driven religious and philosophical thinking. But let's be real, these arguments for God in process theism, they're really interesting, but they're not going to convince everyone, are they?
Of course not. Process theism isn't claiming to have absolute proof. It knows that ultimately whether or not you believe in God involves a kind of leap of faith, a willingness to see the world in a certain way.
And for those people who are willing to take that leap to embrace this process view of reality, what does it offer them?
It opens up a really rich and meaningful way of understanding God and our place in the universe. It gives us a God who isn't distant or uncaring or indifferent to our struggles. It gives us a God who's deeply involved in the world, a God who feels with us, rejoices with us, and suffers with us, a God who invites us to join in the ongoing dance of creation to contribute our own unique piece to the great symphony of existence.
That's a beautiful, inspiring vision.
Yeah.
It's a God who feels so much more real, somehow more relatable, more compassionate, and ultimately more present in our everyday lives.
And that's one of the most powerful things about process theism. It offers a vision of hope, a vision of a God who is always working to bring about good, even in the middle of all the suffering and chaos, a God who's always inviting us to join in that work, to become co-creators of a more beautiful and just world.
This has been quite the deep dive into process theism. We've explored some really mind-bending ideas, challenged our assumptions about God, and discovered a whole new way of looking at the universe and where we fit in it.
It's been great exploring all this with you and to everyone listening. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. We hope it sparked your curiosity, made you think about things in a new way, and left you feeling a sense of wonder and possibility. Until next time, keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep diving deep into the mysteries of existence.